Joining us for what I won't deny is a relatively hastily put together, I won't even call it a webinar today, I'll call it a conversation between three people. We heard a lot of noise last week, as I suspect most of you did, about changes happening at Amazon, particularly around small vendors. And we thought about, well, what do we do? Is it a LinkedIn post that we put out? Do we start to send emails to people? And we thought, let's just get three people that pretend they know what we're on about around a table or a virtual table, and we'll have a chat about the changes that Amazon are putting out there. Before we go into the conversation, which will be a very, very loose conversation today, bouncing about between the three of us, just very, very quick introductions. I'll start with myself. I'm Andy Banks, CEO of VentureForge, and for those of you that don't know us, we are a commercial partner to Amazon brands, helping them successfully navigate, grow, and work out how to do Amazon and how to make it a success for their business. I'm going to work to the right of me. Becca, you're on the right of my screen. We'd like to say hello to everyone.
Hi everyone, I'm Becca, so I am Head of Seller Services for Amazon. So that essentially means that my side of the business was relatively quiet last week. I oversee all of our Seller Central clients, and I've been working in the Amazon space for nearly 10 years. It's a long time.
Jonathan down the bottom.
Nice to see you, everyone. I'm Jonathan Newton, Chief Operating Officer. My role at VentureForge is ultimately to ensure our clients are getting the very best service and the very best results from the team here at VentureForge. I work across a wide variety of seller, vendor, and hybrid accounts. So my world was slightly busier than Becca's last week. So.
Great. Thanks, guys. I'll say today's going to be a conversation. Normally I'm hosting these things, firing questions out and trying to kind of manage the guests and get as much value out there for the audience as I can. But I think today we'll just throw the conversation about between us. We're going to try and delve into what the change that was announced by Amazon last week means. I mean, I don't mean literally means, but try and work out what does it mean for your business? How can you navigate it? I guess there's probably no better place to start than what did Amazon announce last week. I think there's a lot of hype, a lot of noise out there in the market as to Amazon are culling vendor accounts. Amazon are culling small vendor accounts. Jonathan, from your point of view, what was last week's announcement and what do you think it actually meant?
So I guess there was one static announcement, which was Amazon vendor are actively looking to remove trade terms and working agreements with small vendor accounts. If you understood what was being released for the US, that is accounts with less than $5 million turnover. And for the EU, that was less than €2.5 million. So effectively, how we understand
what was announced by Amazon last week means, I mean, I don't mean literally means, but try and work out what does it mean for your business? How can you navigate it? I guess there's probably no better place to start than what did Amazon announce last week. I think there's a lot of hype, a lot of noise out there in the market as to Amazon are culling vendor accounts. Amazon are culling small vendor accounts. Jonathan, from your point of view, what was last week's announcement and what do you think it actually meant?
So I guess there was one static announcement, which was Amazon vendor are actively looking to remove trade terms and working agreements with small vendor accounts. If you understood what was being released for the US, that is accounts with less than $5 million turnover. And for the EU, that was less than €2.5 million. So effectively, how we understand it is that Amazon will cease trade terms. That means they will no longer place purchase orders on those vendors in question. Their trade terms, we believe, will become null and void, and that relationship will end as of approximately the 9th of November.
As you're saying that, mate, I could have got more questions and answers at that point. From the communication that I saw, looking at what we've seen in our business, with the clarity that we've probably got 40-ish brands under management at the moment. Some of those brands are part of the same organisation, but we're spanning vendor, seller, hybrid, UK, Europe, North America. We didn't get a client affected by this unless it's not been shared with us. We've not seen it. It's not been shared with us. So that even though you say there that there's that kind of those different value thresholds, we've got vendors that sit in that space that haven't been affected. They've not been communicated with.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Andy. I think for me, the question to ask ourselves is, why would Amazon take this strategic move to remove those small vendors? You know, these are not going to be vendor accounts which are growing significantly year on year. They're highly likely to be not hitting their net PPM targets. We have to ask ourselves the question, is the catalogue of ASINs relative to the consumer audience anymore? Is the account being mismanaged in any way? So my expectation is, even though there's a lot of noise on LinkedIn, there's a lot of noise around the conversation, and there will be many, many vendors affected by this, my gut feeling, and it's only my gut feeling, is the accounts that are going to be affected the most are the accounts that are probably not actively doing much with Amazon, therefore not thinking about Amazon as a strategic channel. Perhaps they're not engaged in regular correspondence with Amazon in any way, shape or form. So it's entirely possible that a lot of these culling, as we call it, sounds a bit grand, doesn't it? But it's entirely possible that this culling of small vendor accounts is an administrative exercise by vendor to move away a lot of the noise from their systems or a lot of noise from their process, or it is in vendor accounts which are, from all accounts, relatively dormant or relatively small in terms of their trade and activity.
Don't say it feels like a supplier review from a retailer that's managing who it buys stuff from and prioritising strategic relationships and deprioritising those that aren't. Yeah,
I mean, I guess before I turned myself to the dark arts of Amazon and digital, I spent almost 15 years as a retail buyer and a category manager, and this is something you would go through every single year as a retailer. You'd be looking at your supply chain, you'd be seeing who is a great partner, who is perhaps not so much of a good partner, who is giving you the best trade prices or trade terms, who is in the moment that you need to be seen to be working with. And, regrettably, this is retail and this is retail buying. Vendors do come in and out of a portfolio assortment. And I think there's a real common misconception that just because you've got an agreement with Amazon on vendor terms, then it's locked in forever. It could very well be that the brand in question decides that Amazon is not a favorable channel for them and proactively exits the relationship with Amazon. In this instance, it sounds like Amazon are proactively exiting certain vendor relationships, but this is not necessarily new news. And I think there is sometimes a danger just because Amazon do something like this, it tends to hit the press, it starts to bubble away on LinkedIn, and everyone gets a little bit hot under the collar that this is Amazon, the big bad wolf, when in actual fact, it's probably Amazon doing what it should do every year regularly, which is look at its infrastructure, look at its supply chain, look at those efficiencies and where it can make the whole vendor process more streamlined and act accordingly.
I think as well, we've heard a lot over the past few webinars that we've done with all the experts that we've spoken to and people in our team, that vendor management's changing as a whole, that, we're getting less and less conversations. This has probably been happening for years, just that we've never actually sat down and had an email that says, by the way, as of the 9th, we're not going to speak to you anymore. What I'd also be thinking about is, if you're in a position where you've struggled over the last few months with net PPM or last 12 months, because it feels like that's all we've talked about for the last 12 months. Let's get some new lingo, guys. Amazon Basics is a massive thing that's kind of very much gone under the radar. So how many of these smaller sellers have actually come into this and are finding themselves in a relationship now where it's a bit tense, they're not making as much net PPM, Amazon's kind of breathing down the neck. So Amazon's just gone, it's easier for me to go source from somewhere else and buy it and brand it as Amazon Basics.
Well, dare I say, I think that's really all this is, Becca. I mean, Jonathan, you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the retail example. You would never see a headline newspaper that says Tesco terminates 2% of supplier relationships, because that's part of retail buying. They're constantly in that supply chain. They're shifting. No business wants to be employing a lot of people, let's call them vendor managers in this instance, that are managing lots of very, very small supply relationships. An Amazon vendor for me has always been about the strategic, category important relationships, category important assortment that Amazon must have. And you typically go and buy that from the category leaders. And if Amazon's now got a very long tail of people providing a category, and they're looking through that and going, can I chop off 5% of my relationships that aren't strategically important, and that volume will just tip into the remainder of the relationships? Or in the beauty of Amazon's model, tip into seller, where it effectively self-manages. This is purely supply chain management. It's nothing that anybody in any retail world should ever be surprised by.
I think it's, there's an important point here, and I think it's easy to get lost in the headlines, regretfully, €2.5 million or $5 million can be an enormous amount of turnover to an affected vendor account. But in the scheme of Amazon's overview, these are unfortunately minuscule accounts that in the scheme of things are relatively, or perceived to be relatively unimportant. And I think, Amazon is a real customer-centric business. And we always talk about kind of the back of the scenes, but in essence, to the consumer, Amazon are there to service the consumer with the right assortment, quickly on time at the right price. Now, I would be gobsmacked if Amazon had proactively delisted a vendor account where their consumer offering was integral to that category in question. I just don't believe it will happen. So for those vendors that are affected, as harsh as this may seem, as crude as it might seem in terms of that kind of very cold email, which is we're going to start to move away from supplying and talking to you, I think you have to take a step back and ask yourselves, was I selling the right things to Amazon at the right price? Was I behaving as a vendor? And why do I find myself in this position? Because if you can't answer all of those with a very positive, this is why I deserve to stay, the likelihood is possibly Amazon have done you a favor and you've moved away from a vendor relationship that perhaps wasn't benefiting either party. There's a big question. There's a lot of soul searching to do around this, I think.
There's also some big questions around that 2.5 million threshold as well, because I can't imagine that if you were a niche brand in that category that was the only provider of that product into that category, that Amazon will come down and go, you're below that threshold. I really believe the ethos behind this is potentially removing a vast number of low value additive vendors that are not offering any uniqueness in terms of whether it's the revenue or profit they drive through the vendor account for Amazon, not for the vendor, for Amazon, or a product assortment that can't be sourced elsewhere. So if you were, I can't even think of an example, but if you're in the coffee market and you're a £2 million turnover of a particular type of coffee bean that can't be sourced elsewhere, you might still be quite safe. But if you are a generic coffee bean retailer with low net PPM and just another conversation to manage, and if you disappear, that value will go into another brand, I think I'd expect to be culled. But again, none of that should be a surprise. It's supply management.
But sorry, Becca, you go ahead.
No, I think one thing that we maybe need to think about is the emotion that's coming to this is because of the timeline. Amazon's essentially giving people 2 months notice, and I think if we were talking about this and there was a number one in front of that and it was 12 months notice, there'd be a lot less noise. It would be part and parcel of your terms of negotiation. It's just the fact that Amazon have gone, you've got 2 months, and it feels like you've almost gone from, we've got a happy relationship with vendor, or albeit we're sat here thinking there's got to be more at play, to you've got to be out like an end of a lease agreement. And I think that's where the emotion is. That's where the noise is on LinkedIn. That's what all our peers are talking about is you've got 2 months to sort this, and that's not necessarily the case. And I think that's almost like a bit, we just need to take a second and think about what Amazon's actually said.
It's a really good point. Actually, when I was reading the communication before we started chatting today, they've said a lot, but also not said a lot at the same time. So, effective November 9th, our vendor relationship will be terminated. We won't enter into any new agreements or extend current ones beyond this termination date. It doesn't actually say they won't stop placing purchase orders with you. That might just be your current terms of Amazon are up, but we'll still place purchase orders until the end of the current term. It might be we're not placing any more purchase orders, but that stock will still be sold through from Amazon's perspective. It's, dare I say it, the only thing this communication answers is what date. It doesn't actually say exactly what will happen after that point.
Yeah, it's fairly typical Amazon. It's a big announcement with not much substance. And I guess the question will be for those brands affected is there likely to be a follow-up? Are brands going to be left scratching their heads? I mean, for me, there's so many unanswered questions around as we start to head into AVN, the annual vendor negotiation process. Certain brands will have terms that accrue over the course of this calendar year or financial year and move into next year, things like volume incentive rebates. So what does that mean? Does that mean they're effectively cut off from November? What does that mean ahead of future payments as we go into calendar 2025? Lots and lots of big questions. But for me, the thing I keep coming back to the point of is, if I was an Amazon category manager or vendor manager and I've got an abundance of stock in my warehouse and I want to sell that stock through, yes, I can do that based on my own merits because that's the wholesale agreement that I've entered into with the brand. But generally speaking, as we know from our experience, vendor managers will liaise with our brands looking for promotional support, deal support, helping them move that stock through their supply chain. So my instinct is this is not brands with big, bulky ladens of stock sat in Amazon distribution centers, because to cut off such a harsh kind of endpoint November 9, albeit we don't know what that actually means, just effectively feels like an own goal for me. I don't know.
It doesn't even make sense commercially, because put yourself in the position of somebody who's got 90 days stock cover sat there, and let's just say out of a £2.5 million business, that might be £500,000 of stock sat there at Amazon. If Amazon terminated my vendor relationship and they're sat on that stock, how's it going to sell through? Because I'm not going to put my advertising budget in anymore because it doesn't drive me any future deals. So Amazon have got to be very careful and selective here, because otherwise they're going to set on a load of stock that decays. Well, one, takes up storage space. We know how protected they are over that around peak period. 2, the ad revenue will drop on this immediately. 3, moving to seller could be problematic, because you're not going to sell out if Amazon has still got the buy box on the vendor side of things. It could also create a bit of a price battle if Amazon try and liquidate stock by pricing.
I think all those points, Andy, is exactly why my instinct is it's a lot of noise, it's some big statements, but the reality is behind the scenes to those affected, my instinct is it's not that much immediate impact. Now, again, to those who are watching the webinar and to those who may be affected by this, I don't want that to come across as a little bit of passive, well, it won't matter, because those who are in the thick of it, it will matter. It'll be a huge issue. You will need support, and where next is the question. But it does beg the question through all of what we've said so far is this more of an administrative exercise on some very small historical vendor accounts that are perhaps just clogging up systems, processes, time to think, pick bays, rather than any real culling of meaningful vendors? Time will tell, I guess.
You've got to look at the economic situation. Amazon are not growing at the rate they used to. They're still growing, but if you look at this purely from a share price point of view, Amazon need to maintain sales. It's almost counter-logical to kill vendors that are driving stock into the system when you're actually still trying to grow sales. So Amazon can't have done this to big vendors, strategic vendors, people that are driving revenue. This can only be at the bottom end of the tail.
I think the only perhaps alternative kind of position to what we're talking about at the minute is, there's still, and we see it a lot, when we talk to new vendors or even some old vendors, there is still a common misconception that once I've entered into a vendor agreement as a brand, I'm just going to sell the world. I'm just going to put stock into Amazon and it's going to magically fly out the door. Consumers are going to love my products and I just have to sit back and watch the purchase orders roll through to me. We all know that's the biggest misconception there is around vendor. You still have to optimize ASINs. You still have to think of your strategy and your tactics and delivery. You still have to work hard on your advertising budgets and everything else in between that. So there is, for me, a big holding up of a mirror at this point in time off the back of this announcement that if you are a brand and you do find yourself in this situation, is have you been effectively managing that relationship with Amazon just like you would with any other wholesale agreement? You have to put the energy in to get the rewards out. So, I think there's a big conversation here. So it's not just look what Amazon's done to me. It could also be have I really put the required effort into this vendor relationship that has allowed me to trade and not allowed me to find myself in this position of culling. So yeah, it's really great because we don't have all the details, and I'm not too sure we ever will have all the details. But there's a lot of questions to be asked around both on the brand side and Amazon side around this particular topic, I think.
I think the thing is to not have a quick, immediate reaction. You could immediately go, well, Amazon don't want anything to do with me. I'll pull ads. I'll open a seller account and I'm done with vendor. And I think that you almost need to take the time to process. We've got a lot of people who could have 3, 6, 9. You might have just had all your Q4 orders just placed. Mm-hmm. If you're going to let Amazon sit on that stock, you're actually going to detrimentally change what's going to happen to you.
It's really good point, Becca.
While I understand that this will hurt, and it will hurt because it will feel personal, it'll feel like it's come from nowhere, or it may have, there's no warning signs, and the noise is not helping with that. LinkedIn is not helping. It's making it seem much more grand and much more painful. Just take a beat. What is that? What does this actually mean for you? If you've got 6 months cover, maybe means that you don't need to react tomorrow. You could probably take a week, really start to process and think things through.
Yeah, it's a good shout. So I think we know, I think we know what they're doing. That they're going to somehow, in some way, terminate some vendor agreements from the 9th of November. We don't quite know what terminating agreements means, and that'll kind of come out in the wash, but it's pretty clear that for some vendors, their future on vendor is coming or is already here. So it begs the question, so what we've also talked a little bit about why that might have happened. That's important context. But if you're one of these, from what we've said, maybe smaller, less important, maybe less successful, less commercially viable vendors, what are your options? I mean, from my point of view, I can see 3 or 4 routes through this. Do nothing, pack up your bag and jog on, go somewhere else and not deal with Amazon. You could migrate to seller. I'm sure we'll have that conversation. I can see your face lighting up, Becca, as our head of seller. You could deal through a distributor. You could get somebody else to take care of Amazon for you in its entirety. you could probably try and negotiate or work through another kind of channel, work through a master vendor account somewhere else potentially. What are your thoughts? Do you see there's a viable way through this, or do you think there's probably questions to be asked before working that out?
I think it starts with the conversation we were having this time 9 months ago. What is your Amazon strategy? If your Amazon channel was just a passive channel, it's not something you put a lot of time and energy and investment into, it might just be that this 9th of November, once your stock's cleared, that's actually the right thing to do, is just close it down and move on. I would love to sit on this call and say, don't worry, just migrate to seller, it'd be easy. But I can't honestly say that. There's real commercial challenges moving to seller. In some cases, we might have where RRP's product just doesn't work. Big bulky items won't necessarily work. So I think that there needs to be a bigger view of what do you want Amazon to be over the next 12 months. Take out the fact that they've pulled the rug from under you, and what do you want your Amazon account to look like for the next 12 months? Because if you're happy with the B2B model and that's all it is, go find a distro. Go find someone who can do it for you. Go find a master vendor account. If you're willing to give seller a shout, be prepared for an uphill battle from a learning perspective. It's completely different, and we might have sat and done a lot of back and forths. And I know, I've been on a webinar this year with Ant Finch where we basically went head to head against what we were going to talk about. I'm pretty sure I came out on top. It's all right when he's not here to argue for himself. But I think you need to take some real look at your catalogue, what's working, what's not working. Thinking about transitioning to seller. RRPs are a big one. You don't want to just go, everything will work. We know generally 10.99, 12.99 is your cut off. You need to start really looking at this as a real channel and really starting to dive into where you want to be in the next 12, 18, 24 months.
I mean, sorry, Andy.
Go off to you, mate.
No, just to say, it's kind of an extension of Becca's point. I think, that understanding what role Amazon play in your overall channel mix is, for me, the most important thing. Are they a meaningful part? Are they the most integral part? Or are they minuscule in the scheme of things? Now, the selling model doesn't necessarily determine what you should do based on the size of your Amazon business. But for me, I think when you look through this through a commercial lens, whether this is your own business, whether you are a head of e-commerce representing a brand, whether you're a buyer, it doesn't matter what role you're in. You have to start asking the question of how reliant upon Amazon am I as a brand, and how vulnerable am I if my percentage share is, let's say it's in excess of 50%, which in many vendors' case, that will be the case. And am I willing to put my future 50% destiny in the hands of Amazon? Because let's be honest, we've talked about a $5 million, even a $50 million account is relatively small to Amazon. You are really getting into the $500 million territory when you've got really any negotiating power with Amazon. Now, I know there'll be a whole series of people watching this that go, well, hang on a minute, I'm doing 10 million and I've got a vendor manager. Or yes, of course, there's always a relationship with Amazon to a lesser or greater degree. But ultimately, if you've got a significant part of your business in vendor and your business relies on that revenue, you have to start to think, or maybe you should have already thought about having a hybrid strategy so you can put your own destiny in seller, where if Amazon decide to pull the plug, change terms, change pricing, I'm not too sure there's that much you're going to be able to do about it in the scheme of things. So this for me is a big question also about, yes, we're talking about small vendor accounts today, but even the biggest out there, you have to start asking the question of, is my business secure and safe? And I'll use the analogy such as a small emerging food brand who get very excited about their first listing in Tesco, and all of a sudden that's the be all and end all of their business. Now, what if Tesco just cull that as part of their annual supplier review? You're almost back to square one. So having that channel agnostic view of the world and strategy, and I think you have to understand where you want Amazon share to be and what you're capable of doing, and then work out a strategy, to Becca's point, that compensates for all of those things that you're thinking about.
Dare I say, is Amazon the only major retailer out there that allows you, or even gives you a model to operate a backup plan? Because take your Tesco analogy, you're dealing with Tesco on almost like a vendor. They kick you out. Okay, Tesco Marketplace has come back, but in the grocery store, you can't list on a marketplace basis.
Yeah, I suspect there's only the analogy between a digital listing and a store listing. If I go back to my retail buying days, you were restricted with space in the physical store presence, lesser so from a digital point of view, apart from distribution centers and so forth. So you might have that little bit of that fallback position that if it's not working in store, it could work on a digital platform. But, not many, I can't think of any off the immediate top of my head like Amazon, which would give you fulfillment options and selling models that suited your business and suited what they were striving to achieve with the consumer.
It's interesting. A lot of our work as an agency, guys, I think across a lot of the strategy work that we're doing, I'm talking, I'll keep something a bit close to our chest, but we're talking brands here that are 5, 6, 7 million pound plus. Almost everything in the last 12 months has involved some kind of selling model evaluation, whether that's from a commercial point of view, where can I make more cash, whether it's from an operational point of view, where can I operate better and smarter, whether it's from a de-risking point of view, how can I have a backup plan that if for whatever reason Amazon stop placing POs, that might be culling your vendor account, or it might be difficult negotiations, it gives you that avenue. I also want to be really cautious to say this because so much, I want to say it as I see it, there's so much bullshit knocking around our industry at the moment of, hybrids away, get on to sell, you'll make more margin. We know it is nowhere near as simple as black and white as that, otherwise they would be doing it. But there are a lot of merits to it. Now, whether your hybrid strategy is just, I am 100% vendor and seller is there just in case, or whether it's the other way around, I can't see any disadvantage of having both options at your disposal.
No, I think it's just understanding that seller's not going to be a silver bullet. I think if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, it was get onto Amazon seller and sell MFN, then progress to FBA, and your end goal is to be vendor. And at no way on that journey has anyone ever taken into consideration what Amazon might do, because you just thought they were just your natural steps. And then, 18 months ago, it's get off vendor, net PPM, let's transition to hybrid. But, there's some big things. Some businesses are physically not built to be direct to consumer. They're just not, not knowing when orders come through, that reliance on making sure that someone's placing that order. The operational side of dealing with vendor is completely different from a seller perspective. So it's not just I can just pop on seller and it's going to be a really easy situation. You could be in verification for 3 months. There's stuff, this isn't a let's just switch overnight. There's a lot of stuff that needs processing and thinking about before you make that jump. And I think, we've been talking about hybrid for a while, and a lot of our clients have flip-flopped, they've come from vendor to seller and then they're moving back to vendor. And I think it's always going to be a moving piece. I think this is just that Amazon's finally made a decision and they've gone, well, actually, it's easier for us to not have to deal with these X amount of sellers because we won't have to go through terms negotiations. That's the reason they've done it on the 9th of November, is because we're coming up to terms negotiations. They just can have 20, 30, 40, 50% left conversations. But seller is not the be all and end all. And I know that I'm the wrong person to sit here and kind of counter that. But
I think it comes back, sorry to jump over, Becca, I think it comes back to the point again of the uniqueness of how this is affecting the brand in question. So this could be a relatively pain-free exercise for many brands that are just kind of left with a dormant vendor account. It's trickling along the odd PO here and there, and it's not really any focus. It's a distraction. If you're sat there with a significant part of your revenue going through a vendor, you are going to be in distress. You are going to be going, what the hell do I do now? And, you're right to call out some of the challenges around sending. Selling up a seller account isn't as easy as it used to be. And especially if you're a complex business, you may be going through rounds of verification, and that's going to be painful when all you want to do is sell, sell, sell.
Oh, Becca, when you would.
But I think more than anything for me, it's time. And I think I've got two. You for the check. I would have just rambled on there forever, but
it's his South Yorkshire internet connection. Unfortunately, it's not as good as it is down up here.
I think there's two views. If you are an affected vendor,
you're back.
Kind of.
What I would just say
I'll just give it a second just to see if it's still...
While Jonathan's coming back, is what we have to remember is, this announcement came out, a week ago? Mm-hmm. LinkedIn's been completely flooded with it. But the majority of people on LinkedIn, I would say 90% of people in my feed alone are Amazon vendor experts that have just gone, oh no, what do I do if 50% of my agency disappears or 50% of my client base disappears? So they're adding to the volume, and I think you have to stop looking outwards and start looking inwards, and that's where the real truth of this situation will come from.
Yeah. Jonathan, you're still coming and going a little bit. Let me. I'll take the conversation on a slightly different route just whilst things sort out on your side. You go pop another 10 pence in the meter, and we'll walk onto the internet's back up and running. Becca, I'll take us off the seller rabbit hole a second. You mentioned distribution. I think there's a lot of detail we do need to get into on seller actually, because I think that'll be the more obvious route.
Yeah.
I've got a real bee in my bonnet about distribution, because it might feel like an easy route, but I've seen, again, in a couple of projects we've got at the moment, what I call real lazy distributors that say, we're your gateway to Amazon, give us your product, we'll make it a success. And they do absolutely bugger all other than list it and logistically and operationally get the product to market, but they're not adding any value, they're not driving any growth. And you've only got to rewind 18 months. And this call that you're seeing now, 18, 24 months ago, went out across distributors. Amazon wants to get to the main man. They want to buy direct from the source with better margin, and that gives them a better business. So for me, I get why for some people, getting to Amazon through a distributor might be a logical choice here, but I can't help but think it's a sticking plaster, and you want to get away from that long term.
We often talk in quite grand terms when we're talking about Amazon. We always say, take control of your own destiny. All you're doing by moving to a distributor is moving the problem from Amazon to a distributor. So what happens if in 12 months that distributor that you've chosen goes bust, or they decide they're not having a relationship anymore? And I think if your true belief is that a B2B relationship works with Amazon, then it has to be selling to a master vendor account. It has to be selling to someone who's got multiple vendor managers looking after them, covering multiple categories. I think a distro is a really quick and easy win, but it's only a 6-12 month fix. And like you say, Amazon culled however many, we last year were facing into this particularly in the toy sector where it felt really loud, was that Amazon just went, we only want manufacturers. Yeah. And they cut tons of people, even licensees, they just cut them. So this is not too dissimilar to last year. I think it's just don't jump ship just because Amazon have given you the 9th of November.
Yeah, I think for me, jumping out of vendor and using a distributor as your stopgap for this is, I get it. If you're desperate to plug a revenue gap and you're already dealing with a distro that could turn Amazon on, I don't like saying this, but I can see a role for that distributor. But I'd be looking at a 3 to 6 month role and a stopgap whilst you then put a different migration strategy in place.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to, where are you up to with your Amazon business? If you are fundamentally got everything ready, you've got A+ content in place, you've got brilliant SEO, you've got great content, great reviews, it's easier to jump to a distro then because you've done all the hard work. But what about NPD? What about new variations, anything like that? Amazon and the distros are not necessarily going to support you with that journey.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. He's there. He's moving. He looks alive. How was your break?
I feel like I was on a really rampaging, glorious speech there, and I was getting on my soapbox. Now I can't remember the point I was making, but I think what I was going to maybe summarise, and apologies, the conversation's probably moved on, is I think the most important thing for me now is time to take stock.
Yeah.
So whether you are affected by this and are worried what to do, don't just jump. Don't just make that quick move to the distributor, to the seller account. Just take a step back and just go, hang on.
Yeah.
And I know that will feel antiquated because you may be losing sales and the momentum's being lost, but making the right decisions now will affect what happens in the next 3, 6, 9, 12, 3 years, 5 years, who knows. And I think for those who are not affected, I think there's an even more important point is this could happen to you at some point, So are you really focused on doing the best you can possibly do? Are you working with an in-house team, an external team? Are you playing ball with Amazon? Are your metrics in a good place? Start to think about what the consequences are if this was to happen to you and what contingencies you can have in place. And maybe that hybrid account is the right thing to do. Maybe just having a more proactive view on, where's the share of my allocation going? How have I got too many eggs in Amazon's basket? So I think now more than anything, if I was the brand affected by this, I'd be going, okay, maybe this is the wake-up call that perhaps I needed.
And I also think if you've sat there and you've gone, whew, I haven't got the email, there's still time. Like, just because Amazon did their first pass last week doesn't mean another one's not coming. Like, that we know, just working with our contacts within Amazon, that something can be told 24 hours before. So don't think that just because you've made the cut this time that you actually have. I think just be a lot more treat Amazon as a fully realistic situation now, I think, rather than just being we're going to get RPOs, it's fine, we're okay.
All of your optimism, Becca. Amazon telling you something 24 hours before, it's normally 24 hours after.
Well, but I didn't want to be that negative on the call.
So, well, look, we've kind of gone from there, Jonathan. Thanks for coming on summing that on. I think you're absolutely right. That is, when you're at rock bottom, you can't go any lower. So now's the chance to take stock and work out where you go from here. It's actually a massive kick in the shins. Is this the people that are affected? That there's no better time to completely divert course if you need to, because you can't get any lower than where you are now. Yeah. Becca and I had a chat whilst you were rebooting yourself about the pros and cons of distribution. And I kept Becca away from that Seller Avenue, mate. I didn't want to go down Seller Avenue until you were here to kind of help me out with this one. It feels like the most obvious route is Seller if you're in this position. If you are to do Amazon, the most obvious route is Seller. So I'm a vendor. I've literally had the rug pulled from under my feet. Let's be realistic. There's still some stock sat in Amazon. Where do we go from here? What do we do? What are my next steps?
Yeah, you're right. The natural instinctive move is to move over and jump ship to Seller. And I guess if you do want that future opportunity with Amazon, that's likely to be the most viable solution for you to control your own destiny. I mean, whilst I recognise there's many brands are running successful distribution agreements with Amazon, there's pros and cons to doing that, of course. I think for me, it's start to look at the economics around this. What is moving to Seller going to do? So yes, it's going to start the sales machine again, and it's going to start off, that enjoyment of trading with Amazon. But is it going to come at a detrimental margin position, or is it going to come at an enhanced margin position? I think just doing the same thing time and time again. What is it? Someone once famously said this. Was it Einstein? I don't know. Clearly someone very smarter than me, because I can't remember. But it's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome is the definition of insanity. So I think if you were to just lift up your range of ASINs, plonk them into Seller, and do exactly as you have been doing with vendor, why would you get a different outcome? So I think for me, it would be questions like range rationalization. Is my offering still appropriate for the Amazon consumer, and does it make sense for me as a business? Am I selling at the right prices? Look at price elasticity in the category. Has things moved on? Is that possibly the reason why you find yourself with a vendor cull, because you're no longer competitive in the market, or from your COGS position? But more importantly, and Seller will, Becca will talk about this in a bit more detail, but Seller's an entire, sorry, I called you Seller instead of, maybe that's your name from now on. Seller Woollin, that's your new name. So, Seller is an entirely different beast, and there's lots more things to think about from a P&L point of view alone, lots more cost centers, lots more implications, returns, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you would have to start to look at its viability, an A versus B comparison. Does it make sense to my business? Does it make sense to my range? And if not, what am I going to do about it? Because possibly curating a new range, possibly doing something different with my assortment might be the way forward. But I very much doubt it's a lift and shift. I just instinctively doesn't feel right.
I don't think you want lift and shift, like you say. Some stuff will make more money, some stuff will make less, some stuff will land in the same place. You can't, I suppose you could.
It comes back to the same reason that I started off this conversation with. Amazon would not be culling a successful vendor account. So by very definition, if all you're doing is moving it, it's still not going to work, is my instinct, unless it's a net PPM thing. If purely it's about Amazon's profit, that could be a reason, in which case moving to Seller, actually that problem goes away. It's your own profit you need to worry about in that instance. But my instinct is it's broken, which is why it's been delisted or taken away from you, in which case just moving it to the left. You're going to have the same problems, I'm sure.
I think this isn't just financially as well. I think one thing that it might all stack up from a P&L standpoint, but operationally, they are two completely different beasts. So you've got to start thinking about this, not just from yes, it looks good on paper, everything's green. The big operational changes. You're setting up a new Seller account, you automatically go into storage limits or capacity limits. Even worse, you're going to Q4, so they are much more restricted. So what you might find is that your stock in vendor ends mid-December. You might not get enough stock coverage in Seller until March, April, May. So you've got to start thinking about what the actual ramifications are for going to a Seller account. You have to be able to prove the volume, which you can't do while Amazon have got your stock. But you also need the volume to prove that you can sell. So this isn't just about, it stacks up on a P&L, I've got greens, everything's working. Bearing in mind, we will go through a fee increase come February from a Seller point of view. We always do. We've got new fees coming on the 1st of October with a digital listing fee coming. So this isn't just necessarily a case of, it's all good, I'll jump ship. There's a lot more from a P&L point of view, a lot more from a strategic point of view, a lot more from a competition point of view. than just.
I am going to forgive me, Becca, because those who know me best know I'm not exactly always the optimist. I'm more of a harvester or sorrow type guy. But, that all said and done, there is, for brands that are facing this challenge, there is lots of positives about a seller or a hybrid relationship as well. Trade terms, as an example, those who have wrestled with that over the years and have become squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, that's gone with seller.
Yeah.
Any challenges around Amazon's price positioning and how they're positioning your goods and how you're seen in the market is back in your control. Things like gated fees, for instance, A+ Premium, which comes at a heavy charge to many vendor accounts, all of a sudden I'm not going to say it's directly free of charge, but it's much more accessible in seller once you get through a few stage gates and a few hoops. So the control very much shifts back to you because you are now selling direct to the consumer like any other marketplace. So it can have lots and lots of pros, but to Becca's point, we shouldn't just diminish the fact it's really easy. It's just move from right to left and all of a sudden it's job done. It does put more emphasis on you as a brand. Not necessarily much more emphasis that you would have had with vendor because you still should be doing best practice, retail readiness, advertising, etc. So that all doesn't go away, but it does give you more control back, in the majority of cases. And that's something that should be grasped with both hands if you've got the internal capability to do it. If you don't, it's not going to be a magic wand.
You say about the retail readiness. I've been with a couple of brands this past week who are big vendors. And when we're talking to them about how they drive growth, starting to talk to them about better content, better listings, SEO optimized listings, driving advertising. I won't say it's alien, but it's not one of the big levers they're pulling for growth. They're working with Amazon on trade terms to drive growth. They're not really in that growth mindset from an Amazon point of view. Whereas when you talk to a seller, that's normally top of their list. So although the two worlds, I've described Amazon in the last week, Amazon vendor as a push mindset where you're pushing PO, you're pushing stock into Amazon, and most vendors are still mentally assuming that Amazon is selling that through, even though they know they should be driving some growth. Sellers more of a pull mindset when I'm talking to established sellers who are driving growth, driving consumer demand, and that's pulling stock through the system. So whilst I 100% agree with you, the reality on both sides of the fence is the same. To drive growth on vendor or seller, you have to drive consumer demand at the top. That then creates more POs on vendor, or it creates a need to get more stock in on seller. Even though we all know that's the same across both sides, the mindset in a vendor versus a seller, from what I'm seeing, is still very much Amazon will sell it for me on vendor. I need to work on seller. And I think that will be a big leap for some people to make that mindset shift and change where their focus is. Less so on terms negotiation, less so on dealing with a vendor manager, more so on driving top line growth. And by top line, I mean impressions, visibility, traffic to then trickle down to sales.
Yeah, I think there's a very big. I talked about the misconceptions around what a vendor relationship is earlier on. I chuck my stock over the fence to vendor and it magically sells, and we know that's not the case. But I do still think there is and sorry, I'm digressing slightly, but it's a relevant point. I still think there is a very poor onboarding process from Amazon on onboarding vendor accounts, especially that have come off seller through invite only, of course, because I think if Amazon were very, very clear about what that vendor relationship is, which is you have to do all of these things really, really well to avoid chargebacks. You have to do all of these things really, really well to generate consumer demand. We will not market your products for you. You will have to still do all of these things. I bet you bottom dollar there'd be slightly less enthusiasm to jump onto that vendor train. I'd love to see some sort of survey post watershed moment on this, which is for those vendors that have been affected, why do you think this has happened? And it would astound me if the majority of vendors said it just hasn't worked, and I don't know why it hasn't worked, when they won't be looking in the mirror. They will be expecting Amazon to have done that for them. But I think a lot of that challenge lays with Amazon, which is you need to be clear with your vendor community that this is a wholesale relationship, no different if you were selling into a supermarket or no different if you were selling into a large retailer or another marketplace. You have to work on that relationship to get this to work for you. Loads of interesting points floating around this, because I think both brands and Amazon could look at each other and go, your fault. Yeah. And this is why I found myself in this position. It's a mutual relationship to make this work.
But you should have had, I do believe that, as you're saying, that there should have been signs of distress, COG reductions, big bulk buys, all these things. While they may seem, a nice chunky bulk buy seems great at the time, that's probably a sign that Amazon's in distress on your account. So if you've taken a few bulk buys this year, you've let Amazon get a few COG decreases through, you're probably more inclined to be on that list than you would have been if you just held firm and held up that net PPM from your side. I just think that this is part and parcel of Amazon doing what they do. Amazon have to look after number one, and number one is their consumer. So if Amazon can source it and get it cheaper from someone else and brand it as Amazon, they're going to do that. If they can buy it from a bigger vendor and get a bigger bulk reduction, they're going to do that. Because at the end of the day, the customer's going to get that order. It doesn't matter if they buy it from your vendor or your neighbour's vendor account.
Mm-hmm. I know an extra bit woven into that they've got seller. So if they do question your vendor, their product will probably, in most instances, I expect most people listening to this that are in this situation will end up on seller. It might not be 90%, but it'll be certainly north of 50% of people will migrate onto seller. With that in mind, I'm conscious we've had quite a good chat. Actually. We should talk more often, guys. Let's spend 5 or 10 minutes getting some real practicalities. So, Becca, I've been kicked off vendor, God forbid. I'm going to seller. What are my next steps? Where do we go from here?
Assuming that everything that we've talked about today is all stacked up, I would be looking at getting your account set up and verified and getting brand registry in place. So that is a list about this long of things that you need to get an Amazon account verified. But the actual account setup takes day and a half, but verification can take much longer. So starting to think about what your share structure looks like, what is your company information like, and I'm going to say this as bluntly as possible because it never seems to amaze people when I say this. Amazon do not care about your privacy. So your owners of your business or anyone in your hierarchy will have to provide a bank statement and a passport. So starting to grease those wheels internally, because we know that can be often where a blocker comes from. But it comes down to practicalities. Get your account set up, get brand registry linked, and start thinking about what products are going to be listed on there once you get through verification.
Just on that,
in them 3 steps, but
just to cut across there. Sorry, the reason Amazon want all that information, this is another fundamental shift between the platforms. On seller, Amazon are handling payments on your behalf. You're selling to the customer through Amazon, and they're effectively a payment provider. So you are technically opening a bank account for all intents and purposes with Amazon. So it's their know your customer process. And from our experience, I think you're more scarred than the rest of us on this, Becca. They need very clear, surprise, very clear, very factual, very honest information. I think the best scenario we've had, did we not have to get the billionaire owner of a Japanese food brand to provide his passport direct to Amazon, which was, and this food brand is effectively the Heinz of Japan. It's at that level of scale. So they don't leave any stone unturned, but it's because they are moving money on your behalf and it is a legal requirement.
Yeah.
I think with everything that Becca said, which she's absolutely right, if you are contemplating moving to seller, starting that process of opening the professional seller account is the right thing to do, because it can take time and there's a lot of due diligence and hoops to jump through. But I must counsel, whilst that's going on, take a step back. Look at whether seller is the right thing for your business. Can you operationally run a seller model? Can logistically you supply that seller model, and does it stack up from a commercial point of view? If the answer to any of those 3 is no, you've got a bigger question to ask yourselves about trading on Amazon. Now, again, it comes back to my earlier point around the size and share and importance of Amazon. By all means, start the seller process because it can take time. But whilst that is going through, go back to basics. Dot the I's, cross the T's. Can I operationally run this business if it's important to me? We over the years as an agency have seen clients from very large to very small, and there's lots and lots of businesses that believe this is easy, and it's not. If the truth be known, Amazon is a complex beast, and it requires pinpoint accuracy in terms of adherence to their processes to make this work. And you can get into hot water, just like those who are on vendor account who've suffered from chargebacks over the years. There is equally as stringent measures when it comes to seller accounts, like suppressed listings being removed, accounts being closed down at a minute's notice for non-adherence to seller policies. So, I'd really encourage you speak to an expert, whether that's ourselves, whether that be an independent consultant, whether that's go and do your own research. Make sure you can run a seller business before you do it, because inevitably you're going to tie yourself in knots and cost yourself a lot of money, time and heartache in the process if you don't do it well.
So we've jumped through the hoops. We now have a seller account. We've clearly, Jonathan, I love your approach. We've kind of made sure it's actually worth doing it in the first instance, and that what we're going to take forward is worth taking forward. What about practicalities, Becca, of listings? I'm a vendor business. Have I got to go and recreate all of those on Seller? Can I press the magic copy and paste button, or am I selling the same product via a different model?
Yeah, I mean, you can bask in your glory if you've got through verification at that point. You are using same ASINs. You can list products like for like. You don't have to redo all your content, although I would recommend that you move your A+ across, just to make sure that everything's held within Seller Central. Amazon are essentially an active catalogue, so anything that you put in stays in there until a contributor changes that. But yeah, you're essentially lifting catalogues across. I will say to those of you that have worked in the Vendor Central space that Seller Central is much more user-friendly. I have worked both, and I will happily sit here and I'll die on this hill that Seller Central is easier to navigate. But from a practicality point of view, I would be looking at what your lead times were on Vendor, understanding how much stock you were carrying, how much cover you were looking to, and then looking at your capacity. So making sure you've got enough capacity in there. You might be one of the lucky ones where Amazon can recognise your vendor account details on a seller account, and you might go in with a much more increased capacity limit. But everything can translate across pretty quickly. It is just a case of the only caveat, and it's a shame that we can't unfortunately have any of our paid managers on here, is that your advertising isn't just a quick copy and paste job. That is essentially a rebuild, assuming you were doing advertising, of course, from a vendor perspective.
Now, we should have had Jake on this call, but I'm pretty sure before his laptop died, I heard him say something like, the dog's eating my laptop. So he was hoping to join us, but it didn't go particularly well. But we asked Jake to give us his thoughts. He's absolutely right. Your advertising account it's not, unlike your listings, which live on the Amazon platform, and they can be access is the wrong way of describing it, but you can influence the same listing via Vendor Central or Seller Central. Advertising is completely separate. And I think it's also not just separate from a technical point of view. Actually requires different approaches in terms of how you're measuring success, because you're now selling actual product to the consumer, and that's your revenue in. Whereas in a previous world, you would try to drive POs and link advertising success to PO throughput. Jake gave us a few tips on what you could do to migrate that. Some quite nice time-saving tips around bulk operations and exporting campaigns from Vendor Central, but there is no easy way of pressing copy paste from vendor to seller. So one thing to be aware of from an advertising point of view, you are into a very manual process here of rebuilding those campaigns effectively. You can shortcut that process through bulk operations, bit of spreadsheet magic in the middle, but you can't migrate campaigns from one to the other. Equally, at the same time, you're going to lose all of that history on the advertising campaigns as well. So whilst you're not at square one, back at ground zero, you've got your learnings in your head. You've not got your learnings and you've not got your data in the platform.
I think there's also a really, I think you just briefly touched on it there, Andy, but there's a big question around advertising efficiency as well. It depends on how you've been measuring just your success around advertising and vendor. But, if you've been around advertising efficiency as well, it depends on how you've been measuring just your success around advertising and vendor. But, if you've been working to ROI on a cost price, i.e. I sell my product to Amazon for X pounds, but I'm spending Y in advertising, that is a completely different profit calculation than if you're now selling to the end consumer with, in theory, a richer margin. But that's not to say that CPCs are going to fluctuate, category targeting is going to be any different. So it is a very, very different beast depending on how you've historically been working your KPIs through vendor versus what you would need to work them through a seller. So again, even if it was a luxury of copying and pasting, there'd be a much bigger impact of just doing that than not doing it. Case maybe.
That point of the metrics, I don't think I shared this with you guys. Last week, myself and one of our team were presenting a strategy to a client comparing vendor versus seller and distributor. And we'd sense checked everything. We'd been through it. We knew what we'd done was solid. And there was a moment about 24 hours before the presentation where we looked at the spreadsheet and went, hang on, have we got something fundamentally wrong here? Because the margin of coming from vendor to seller had actually gone backwards, where our entire story was saying it went forwards. It had gone in the right direction. The cash margin had more than doubled, but the actual margin percentage had drastically dropped because you're comparing a retail price against the cash margin on a seller model, whereas on a vendor model, a vendor P&L is built around the PO income down to the actual margin. So that sits at a P&L level, but equally down through your advertising campaigns, dare I say it, down through almost every financial metric. You're going to be speaking a different language. And I know we started from advertising here, but actually the language of running a seller model versus a vendor model from a financial analysis, ROI success point of view is actually quite different.
Yeah.
Dare I say I prefer it on the seller side. I think the granularity and instant level of data you can get to, and we can see a P&L on seller within 4 hours, give or take. On vendor, it still involves a lot of retrospective work. So yeah, personally, I prefer that, but there are some big differences.
I think, I'd quite like to say I've been on both sides here. I've been very fair towards vendor and seller. But for those people who are seeing this as a sort of a doomsday, there are some really great things about seller. You get live customer data. So you're understanding things like lifetime value. You've got subscribe and save data in there. You're actually getting that information. Brand analytics on seller is sensational. We're understanding at what point our customer journey is changing. The reporting is probably 18 to 24 months ahead of where vendor is. So you gain a lot more insights. While I understand that you've got this safety blanket of what vendor is, Amazon seller could be game changing for a business that maybe wants to know a bit more about the consumer, maybe wants to learn a little bit more about what's happening. Why is your bestsellers different on Amazon to where it is anywhere else in the business? And that's the sort of information and insight you can get down to from an from a seller point of view. Jonathan's alluded to it. That stuff's necessarily a little bit cheaper. Amazon Vine, if you're a big vendor, is a couple of £1,000s to get an ASIN through that. On seller, we're at £140. So there are some wins to lean towards, because I do believe I could have sat on this call and done that 60-minute webinar on how great a seller is. But there are some really big perks to being able to kind of see a different way of working with Amazon that might be more beneficial for your future.
Right. Thank you, Becca. I want to draw us to a close, guys. I didn't say it at the beginning, but we normally do Q&As on these webinars. I think because of the depth of conversation we're going to get into today, we decided not to go on and do the Q&A at the end. So apologies if you've been sat here waiting for our Q&A, but hopefully the depth of the conversation we've got into has been really good and helpful to you, most importantly. Becca, I'm impressed by your balance today. I love the fact that you've not been straight down the cellar. Jonathan, the positivity, I've loved it. It's been fantastic.
I don't even know who I am today. Apologies.
It was that mid-webinar reboot. The different Jonathan came out. It was fantastic to see. I guess to close off, from our side, hopefully what you take from all of our webinars is we're not here to sales pitch. We're here to genuinely add value. And we appreciate that for people that are affected by this vendor cull, and we hope that for those of you out there, it's not as big a hit as it might feel. Please do reach out to us. I'm Andy at ventureforge.co.uk. It's Jonathan at ventureforge.co.uk or Becca at ventureforge.co.uk. We're not here to sell you something. If you want half an hour with either of us to chat through where you find yourself, find out a bit more information, see how we might be able to help, or just offer you some advice, please reach out to us. We know that when your back's against the wall, it's not a nice place to be. And hopefully what you've taken today is we're a decent bunch of guys that know our stuff. So if you do want any help, drop us a line and we'd love to help you. And if we don't hear from you, we'll see you on our next webinar, which I'm sure we will be in your inbox pestering you about within a matter of days. Becca, Jonathan, thanks for your time. Really good conversation.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Becca. Take care. Thanks, everyone. Bye.